At 60, I lost my home, my money, and my voice, and the people who took it smiled across the dinner table like nothing had happened. I remember that night with a clarity that still surprises me. The way the chandelier light reflected off the polished oak table. The way the plates were set just right as if it were any ordinary family dinner. The kind I had hosted for decades without ever imagining I would one day be sitting there as a stranger in my own life. Ashley had chosen the menu, something modern and expensive. Nothing like the meals I used to cook when Daniel was growing up. Back when he would sit at this same table and tell me about his day, his voice full of trust, his eyes always searching for mine. That night, he barely looked at me. He kept his gaze on his glass, swirling the wine slowly, as if the movement itself could keep him from having to speak. I noticed it immediately, that silence, that distance, but I told myself I was imagining things, that grief had a way of making everything feel colder than it really was. I had only turned 60 a few weeks before, and while I didn't feel old, I had begun to notice how quickly people start speaking around you instead of to you, how decisions begin to happen in rooms you're no longer invited into. Still, I never expected what came next. Ashley leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed, her smile polite but practiced, and said, "Margaret, we've been meaning to talk to you about the house." The house. She said it like it wasn't mine, like it hadn't been the place where I raised my son, where I built a life brick by brick alongside my late husband, where every corner held a memory I could still walk through with my eyes closed. I folded my hands in my lap, steady, composed, the way I had learned to be over the years, and I nodded for her to continue. Daniel still didn't look at me. "It's just too much for you now," she went on, her tone light, almost concerned. "Too big, too expensive, too unnecessary." Unnecessary. The word landed softly, but it echoed. I glanced at Daniel then, waiting, hoping, expecting him to correct her, to remind her that this was still my home, that I was still his mother. But he only cleared his throat and said, "We think it's time to make some changes." We. Not you. Not me. We. I felt something shift in that moment. Not break, not shatter, just move, like a piece of furniture being quietly rearranged when you're not in the room. I realized then that this conversation had been planned long before I sat down at that table. The documents, the decisions, the quiet conversations I hadn't been part of, they had already happened. This dinner was just the performance. I picked up my fork, took a small bite of food I couldn't taste, and nodded again, as if I understood, as if I agreed, as if I were still part of the family they were pretending to include me in. But inside, something else was happening. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't angry. I was watching, listening, remembering every word, every glance, every silence. Because in that moment, while they believed they were taking everything from me, I realized something they hadn't considered. They thought I had lost my voice. What they didn't know was that I had simply chosen to stop speaking. I did not argue that night, and that surprised even me, because for most of my life I had been the one who kept everything together, the one who spoke up when something felt wrong, the one who reminded everyone what mattered. But as I sat there watching my son and his wife discuss my future, as if it were a simple adjustment, like changing a piece of furniture or repainting a room, I realized that speaking would not change anything. Not now. Not when the decision had already been made without me. So instead I listened, I observed, and I let them believe that I was simply overwhelmed, too tired to fight, too lost to understand what was happening around me. Ashley continued explaining things in that careful, polished tone of hers, the kind that sounds kind on the surface but leaves no room for disagreement underneath. She talked about downsizing, about how a smaller place would be easier for me, about how they would help manage everything. And I noticed the way she emphasized that word help, stretching it just slightly, as if it were a gift rather than a quiet takeover. And Daniel nodded along beside her, still avoiding my eyes, still choosing silence over truth. And that silence told me more than anything he could have said out loud. When dinner ended, I cleared my plate like I always did. Even though Ashley insisted I should sit down and relax, I carried it to the sink, rinsed it slowly, feeling the familiar rhythm of the motion grounding me in a way nothing else could. And as the water ran over my hands, I began to notice the details I had missed before, the small changes that suddenly made sense. The new lockbox sitting on the counter that I did not recognize, the stack of mail that had been moved out of its usual place. The absence of certain documents I had kept neatly organized for years. Nothing was missing in an obvious way, nothing that would have made me react immediately, but enough had shifted to tell a quiet story, one that I had not been meant to hear. Later that evening, after they had both gone upstairs, I walked through the house alone, not like someone who lived there, but like someone visiting for the last time. I ran my fingers along the back of the couch where Daniel used to fall asleep as a teenager. I paused by the hallway where my husband once hung family photos. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the space where I had spent so many mornings making coffee before anyone else woke up, and for the first time I saw it. Clearly, not as my home, but as something they had already claimed. I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed I had shared for decades, and I opened the drawer of my nightstand out of habit, expecting to see the folder where I kept copies of important documents. But it was gone, not misplaced, not hidden, simply gone. And I did not panic. I did not rush downstairs to ask questions. I did not call out to Daniel or confront Ashley, because in that moment something inside me settled into place with a quiet certainty. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not care. This was a plan, and it had been unfolding slowly, carefully, while I was still trusting them. I closed the drawer gently and leaned back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of their voices upstairs, soft and distant, and I realized that they believed I had no idea what they were doing. They believed I was still the same woman who would accept whatever they told her, who would step aside to keep the peace, who would trust that family meant protection. But they had forgotten something important. I had spent a lifetime learning how people move when they think you are not watching, how they speak when they believe you will not question them. And as I lay there in the quiet of that room, I began to piece everything together, not with anger, not with fear, but with patience, because if they had taken the time to build this plan, then I would take the time to understand it, and more importantly, to decide exactly how I was going to respond. The next morning, I woke before the sun, the way I always had, long before Daniel was born, long before this house had even felt like a home, and for a moment, just a brief moment, everything felt the same. The quiet hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the faint light beginning to press through the curtains, the steady rhythm of a life that used to feel certain. But then I remembered, not in a rush, not in panic, just a quiet awareness settling over me like a shadow that no longer needed to hide. I got out of bed slowly and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the driveway. Daniel's car was already there, parked slightly crooked the way he always did when he was in a hurry, and Ashley's car sat beside it, perfectly aligned, precise, controlled, just like her, and I realized they had stayed overnight, which meant whatever they were planning, it was not something they intended to delay. I dressed without turning on the lights, moving through the room by memory alone, and when I opened the closet, I noticed something else, a few empty hangers spaced too neatly among the others, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to confirm what I already suspected. Pieces of my life were being removed in small, careful increments, the kind that would not be questioned until it was too late to stop. I went downstairs and found Ashley already in the kitchen, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in her hand, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, as if she had been there for hours preparing for the day. "You are up early," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, and I nodded, reaching for a mug. "Old habits," I replied. And for a moment, we stood there in silence, the kind of silence that used to feel comfortable, but now felt measured, intentional. Like a pause in a conversation, neither of us was willing to begin honestly. Daniel came in a few minutes later, glancing between us briefly before pouring himself coffee, and I watched him carefully, not as a mother watching her son, but as someone observing a stranger, looking for signs, for hesitation, for anything that might suggest he was uncertain about what they were doing. But there was nothing, just a quiet compliance, a man who had already decided where he stood. "I was thinking," Ashley began, setting her cup down with a soft click against the counter, "we could start organizing some of the paperwork today, just to make things easier moving forward." And there it was again, that word easier, always wrapped in kindness, always leading somewhere else, and I nodded. "That sounds fine," I said, my voice steady, even, and I saw the brief flicker of relief in her eyes, not because I agreed, but because I did not resist. After breakfast, Daniel left for work, or at least that is what he said, and Ashley stayed behind, moving through the house with a quiet sense of purpose, opening drawers, checking cabinets, making notes on her phone, and I followed at a distance, not in a way that would be obvious, but enough to see what she chose to touch, what she chose to ignore, and it became clear very quickly that she was not organizing anything for my benefit. She was taking inventory. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside under the pretense of getting fresh air, but in truth, I needed space to think, and as I stood on the front porch, looking out at the street I had lived on for more than 30 years, I began to understand the full shape of what was happening. This was not about helping me. This was not about making my life easier. This was about removing me, piece by piece, from a place they had already decided belonged to them. I took a slow breath and looked back at the house, really looked at it, not as something I was about to lose, but as something they believed they had already taken, and for the first time since that dinner, I allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile, because if they thought I was unaware, if they believed I was simply going along with everything they suggested, then they were giving me something far more valuable than control. They were giving me time, and time, I had learned, was the one thing that could change everything when used correctly. By the afternoon, the house had begun to feel unfamiliar in a way that had nothing to do with furniture or walls and everything to do with presence, or rather the absence of mine, because Ashley moved through each room with a quiet authority that suggested she already belonged there more than I did, opening drawers I had organized for years, flipping through folders without asking, pausing occasionally to type something into her phone as if she were cataloging an inventory that had never been hers to claim, and I followed just far enough behind to see what she touched, what she skipped, what she lingered on, because patterns reveal more than actions when you are patient enough to watch them unfold. When she reached the study, she hesitated for just a second before stepping inside, and that hesitation told me everything, because that room had always been mine, not in name, not in paperwork, but in function, in memory, in the quiet rituals of managing bills, storing records, keeping track of a life that had been built carefully over decades. And now she stood in the doorway as if deciding how much of it she could take without being questioned. I stayed in the hallway, leaning lightly against the wall, and listened to the soft sounds of paper shifting, drawers opening, the faint click of a pen against wood, and I realized then that whatever documents had gone missing the night before were not the beginning of this process. They were simply the part one had finally noticed. After a few minutes, she called out to me, her voice bright, almost cheerful. "Margaret, do you know where you keep your older financial records, anything from 5 or 10 years ago?" And I stepped into the room slowly, meeting her gaze with a calm I had not known I could maintain so easily. "Why would you need those?" I asked, not confrontational, not defensive, just curious, and she smiled, that same polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Just trying to get a full picture. You know, make sure everything is in order." And I nodded as if that made sense, even though we both knew it did not, because no one asks for 10 years of records unless they are trying to rewrite something that has already been written. I walked past her to the bookshelf where I kept a small locked box, the kind most people would overlook because it did not look important, and I rested my hand on it for a moment before stepping away. "Most of what matters is already handled," I said quietly, and I saw the brief flicker of irritation in her expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by that calm control she worked so hard to maintain. The rest of the afternoon passed in a similar rhythm, her moving, observing, noting, and me watching, listening, storing every detail the same way I had stored everything else in my life, carefully, deliberately, without drawing attention to the process itself. At one point, she took a phone call in the kitchen, speaking in a lower tone, but not low enough to escape notice, and I caught fragments of her conversation, words like transfer, appraisal, timeline, each one falling into place like pieces of a puzzle I no longer needed to force together, because the picture was already clear. They were not just preparing for me to leave, they were preparing for me to disappear from the equation entirely. I returned to the living room and sat down in the armchair by the window, the one my husband used to sit in every evening, and I placed my hands neatly in my lap, staring out at the yard that had once felt like an extension of my life, and I let the quiet settle around me, not as something empty, but as something useful, because silence, I had learned, is where people reveal the most when they believe they are alone. And as I sat there, listening to the faint movements of Ashley in the other room. I began to think not about what I had already lost, but about what they had not yet realized I still had, because while they were busy dividing up what they believed belonged to them, they had overlooked one thing entirely, the fact that I had been the one managing everything all along, the one who knew where every account was, every document, every decision that had ever been made. And knowledge, unlike property, is not something you can simply take away from someone without them noticing. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting my gaze drift across the room, and for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was being pushed out. I felt like I was stepping back, just enough to see the full picture, just enough to understand exactly how they thought this would end, and more importantly, exactly how I was going to change that ending. That evening, after Ashley finally retreated upstairs and the house fell into a quieter rhythm, I returned to the study and closed the door behind me. Not with urgency, not with fear, but with the kind of calm that comes when you stop hoping things are not what they clearly are, and instead begin working with the truth in front of you. And I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light, taking in the familiar shapes of the desk, the shelves, the small details that had once been part of my daily routine but had slowly been pushed to the edges of my attention over the past few months. And I realized that while they had been planning their version of events, I had been living inside the structure they were trying to dismantle, and that gave me something they did not have: context, memory, and most importantly, understanding. I walked to the bookshelf again, and this time I did not hesitate. I reached for the small locked box and opened it with the key I kept hidden in a place no one would think to look, not because it was clever, but because it was simple, and simplicity is often overlooked by people who are busy searching for complexity, and inside were copies, not originals, never originals. I had learned that lesson years ago when my husband first insisted that we organize everything properly: accounts, property, records, legal documents, all of it carefully duplicated and stored in more than one place, not out of distrust, but out of caution, the kind that comes from building a life you do not want to lose to something as fragile as a single piece of paper. I sat down at the desk and began going through the files slowly, methodically, not rushing, because rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes are exactly what I could not afford now. And as I reviewed each document, I began to see where things had shifted, small changes at first, signatures that looked slightly different, dates that had been adjusted, accounts that had been consolidated in ways I did not remember approving. And none of it was obvious enough to stand out on its own, but together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore, a pattern of gradual control, of quiet transfers, of decisions made just far enough outside my awareness to avoid confrontation. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to let the pieces settle into place, because once you see the full picture, you cannot unsee it. And I thought about Daniel, about the boy who used to ask me before making even the smallest decision, about the young man who once told me he trusted me more than anyone else. And I wondered when that trust had shifted, when it had been replaced by this quiet alignment with someone who saw everything in terms of ownership and advantage. But I did not dwell on it, because understanding why would not change what had already happened. Instead, I focused on what still remained within my control, and that list, I realized, was not as small as they believed. I opened a separate folder, one I had not touched in years, and inside were documents that had never been part of our day-to-day discussions: backup accounts, contingency plans, decisions my husband and I had made quietly, not because we expected anything like this, but because we believed in being prepared. And as I flipped through those pages, I felt something steady settle inside me, not relief, not satisfaction, but clarity. They had taken what they could see, what they could access, what they believed defined my position, but they had not taken everything, because they did not know everything existed. I stood up and carefully returned the documents to their places, locking the box again, placing it back on the shelf exactly where it had been, not hidden, not concealed, just present in a way that made it invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. And as I turned off the light and stepped out of the study, I heard Ashley's footsteps upstairs, moving from one room to another, still planning, still organizing, still certain that everything was unfolding according to her design. And I allowed myself a small, quiet acknowledgement of that certainty, because certainty can be a powerful thing, but it can also be a blind spot. And as I walked down the hallway toward my room, I understood something with complete precision. They believed they were preparing me to leave, but in reality, they were giving me exactly what I needed: time, access, and the space to move without being questioned, and I intended to use every bit of it. The next morning, I did not wait for Ashley to start moving through the house again. I moved first, not in a way that would draw attention, not with urgency, but with quiet intention, the kind that looks like routine to anyone who is not paying close attention. And that was exactly what I needed, for everything I did to seem ordinary, predictable, harmless. I made my coffee the same way I always had, measuring carefully, letting it brew just long enough, standing at the counter as if nothing had changed. And when Ashley came downstairs, she glanced at me briefly, then at the kitchen, then back at her phone, already distracted by whatever list she was building in her mind. And I understood then that she no longer saw me as part of the equation. I had already been reduced to something temporary in her plans, something to be managed, moved, and eventually removed. That assumption worked in my favor. After breakfast, I excused myself quietly and went to my room, closing the door behind me just enough to suggest privacy without secrecy. And I sat at the small desk by the window where I used to write letters, not emails, not messages, but actual letters, back when communication required time and thought. And I opened my notebook, the one I had kept for years without anyone ever asking what I wrote inside it. And I began listing everything I knew, not emotionally, not as memories, but as facts, accounts, names, dates, patterns, each detail placed carefully on the page so that nothing would be left to chance later. I wrote down the accounts I still had access to, the ones that had not been touched yet. I noted the changes I had observed in the documents, the signatures that did not align, the transfers that had no clear authorization, and as I wrote, I felt something shift again, not inside the house, but inside myself, a clarity that replaced the last traces of uncertainty, because once something is written down, it becomes real in a different way. It stops being a feeling and starts becoming a plan. Around mid-morning, I made a phone call, not from the main line in the house, not from anywhere obvious, but from my cell phone as I stepped outside under the pretense of checking the mail, and I kept my voice low, steady, speaking only what was necessary, confirming an appointment, arranging a time that would not interfere with the routine Ashley expected me to follow. And when I ended the call, I stood there for a moment, looking at the mailbox, at the street, at the quiet normalcy of everything around me, and I realized how easy it is for life to appear unchanged even when everything underneath it has shifted completely. When I returned inside, Ashley was in the living room, reviewing something on her laptop, and she glanced up just long enough to acknowledge me before returning to her screen, and I saw then that she was not watching me. Not really. She was focused on outcomes, on results, on the end of a process she believed was already secured, and that confidence created a gap, a space where I could move freely without interruption. In the afternoon, I gathered a few personal items, nothing obvious, nothing that would suggest I was preparing for anything, just small things, documents I knew still held value. A few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother, items that carried more than financial worth, and I placed them in a simple bag, one that blended in with everything else, because the goal was not to hide, it was to avoid being noticed at all. As the day moved forward, I continued playing the role they expected, answering Ashley's questions with calm agreement, nodding when she explained her plans. For the house, for the finances, for what she described as my next chapter, and I listened carefully to every word, because even in her confidence, she revealed details she did not realize she was sharing, timelines, expectations, assumptions about what I would and would not do, and each of those details became another piece of the structure I was quietly building. That evening, when Daniel returned, he seemed more relaxed than the night before, as if something had already been settled in his mind. And during dinner, he spoke more, but not to me. Not really. He spoke around me, including me in conversation only when it required acknowledgement, and I responded the same way I had all day, calm, steady, predictable, giving him exactly what he expected to see, because the less he questioned me, the more space I had to act. And as I sat there, listening to them talk about plans that no longer included me, I realized something with complete certainty. They believed this was the part where I slowly stepped aside, where I accepted what they had decided, where I faded quietly out of the life I had built. But what they did not understand was that I had already stepped into a different role entirely, not as someone being removed, but as someone preparing, carefully and deliberately, to take back everything they thought they had already claimed. The following day unfolded exactly as I expected, not because I could predict every detail, but because once people believe they are in control, they become consistent, almost predictable in the way they move, the way they speak, the way they stop questioning what they think they have already secured. And Ashley moved through the morning with that same quiet confidence, her laptop open on the dining table, papers spread neatly in front of her, her phone within reach, everything arranged in a way that suggested progress, as if she were already transitioning from planning to execution. I stayed out of her way, at least on the surface, keeping to my usual routine, making small movements that would not draw attention. But all the while I was observing, collecting, confirming, because there is a difference between suspecting something and knowing it completely, and I needed to know. Around late morning, she stepped outside to take a call, and for a brief moment, the house fell into a silence that felt different from the others, not empty, but open, and I moved without hesitation, not rushed, not frantic, just direct. I walked to the dining table and glanced at the papers she had left behind, not touching anything at first, just reading, letting my eyes take in the headings, the structure, the language, and it was all there, clearly laid out: property valuation estimates, transfer timelines, projected sale figures, and a document that caught my attention immediately, a preliminary authorization form that included my name, not as the decision maker, but as a formality, a signature they intended to obtain, not request. I picked it up carefully, scanning the details, and there it was, a signature line already filled in, my name written in a way that looked close enough to pass at a glance, but not close enough to be real, and I felt no shock, no surge of anger, just a quiet confirmation of everything I had already begun to piece together. Because this was not care, this was not help, this was control, structured, deliberate, and nearly complete. I set the paper back exactly where it had been, aligning the edges precisely, leaving no trace that I had looked at it, and returned to the living room just as Ashley came back inside, her expression composed, her tone unchanged, and she continued her work as if nothing had happened, because in her mind, nothing had been interrupted. Later that afternoon, I left the house for the first time since this began, not with any announcement, not with any explanation beyond a simple, "I need to run an errand." And Ashley barely looked up from her screen when I said it, which told me everything I needed to know. She did not see me as someone who required attention anymore. I was already categorized, already accounted for, and that made my absence unimportant in her calculations. I drove slowly, not because I did not know where I was going, but because I wanted the time to think clearly, to review everything I had seen, everything I had confirmed, and by the time I reached my destination, I was not uncertain anymore. I was prepared. The office was exactly as I remembered it, quiet, orderly, the kind of place where details matter and assumptions are questioned. And when I sat down across from the man who had known my husband for years, who had helped us organize our affairs long before any of this had begun, I did not need to explain everything from the beginning. I only needed to fill in the gaps, and as I spoke, calmly, clearly, laying out the facts without emotion, I saw the shift in his expression, not surprise, but recognition, the kind that comes when something aligns too perfectly with patterns that have been seen before. We reviewed the documents I had brought, compared them to official records, noted the discrepancies, the unauthorized changes, the signatures that would not withstand close examination. And for the first time since this started, I was no longer the only one who understood what was happening, and that changed everything. When I left the office, the air felt different, not lighter, not easier, but sharper, more defined, as if the edges of the situation had finally come into focus. And as I drove back to the house, I realized that the balance had shifted quietly, without confrontation, without any dramatic moment. It had shifted in a way they would not see coming. Because while they had been building their plan around what they believed I did not know, I had been building mine around everything they had overlooked. And as I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a moment, looking at the house, at the place they believed was already theirs, and I understood something with complete certainty. They had taken their time setting this up, carefully, deliberately, step by step, and now, so would I. When I walked back into the house that afternoon, nothing had changed on the surface. Ashley was still at the dining table, her laptop open, her posture relaxed, the same documents spread neatly in front of her as if they had been there all day, untouched by anything that might challenge her certainty, and she looked up briefly when I entered, offering a small, polite smile before returning to her screen, and I realized then just how completely she believed in the version of events she had constructed, a version where I was already stepping aside, already accepting everything without question, already moving toward an outcome she had carefully designed. I set my keys down in their usual place and moved through the house with the same calm rhythm I had maintained all week, not rushing, not hesitating, because consistency is what keeps people from looking too closely. And as I passed the dining table, I allowed my gaze to drift briefly over the documents again, just enough to confirm that nothing had changed, that everything was still exactly where she had left it. And that told me something important. She was not worried about being discovered. She was not concerned that I might look more closely, and that lack of concern was the final piece I needed. Over the next few days, I continued exactly as before, following the routines they expected, responding in the ways they anticipated, allowing Ashley to move forward with her plans without resistance. And in doing so, I gave her what she needed to feel secure, because people reveal more when they believe there is no opposition. She began speaking more openly, not to me, but around me, discussing timelines, mentioning potential buyers, even referencing conversations with agents as if those steps were already underway, and each time, I listened quietly, storing the information, noting the details, because every assumption she made was another point of leverage I could use later. Daniel, for his part, seemed to retreat further into the background, his involvement reduced to brief confirmations and quiet agreement, and I stopped looking for any sign of hesitation from him, because by then it no longer mattered. His position was clear, and clarity, even when it is painful, is more useful than uncertainty. Midweek, Ashley handed me a set of papers, her tone carefully measured, her expression composed, and she explained that these were just preliminary forms. Nothing final, nothing binding, just something to help move things along. And I took them from her without comment, glancing down at the pages as if I were seeing them for the first time, even though I already knew exactly what they contained, and I nodded slowly, folding them neatly. "I will take a look," I said, and she smiled, satisfied, because she believed that step was inevitable, that my agreement would follow as naturally as everything else had appeared to. That evening, I sat in the study again, the same quiet space that had once been part of my daily life, and I placed the papers on the desk, not to review them, not to question them, but to position them within the larger structure I had been building, because by then, everything had shifted, not visibly, not in a way they could detect, but in a way that mattered far more than appearances. I no longer felt like I was reacting to what they were doing. I was anticipating it, guiding it, allowing it to unfold in a way that would serve my purpose rather than theirs. The next morning, I made another call, brief, precise, confirming that everything was in place, that the discrepancies we had identified were being addressed, that the steps we had discussed were moving forward. And when I ended the call, I stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the same quiet street, the same familiar view, and I realized how different everything felt now, not because anything had changed externally, but because I understood exactly where this was going, not their version of events, but mine. By the end of the week, Ashley's confidence had grown even stronger. She spoke as if the outcome was already decided, as if the final step was simply a matter of timing, and I allowed that belief to remain untouched, because the more certain she became, the less prepared she would be for anything that did not follow her plan, and that was exactly what I needed. And as I sat there that evening, listening to her outline what she thought would happen next, I realized that we were no longer moving toward the same conclusion. We were moving toward two completely different endings, and only one of them was based on the truth. The moment came on a quiet afternoon, not announced, not dramatic, just another step in the sequence Ashley believed she was controlling. She placed the final set of documents in front of me at the dining table, her posture composed, her tone steady, and she explained once again that everything was ready, that all that remained was my signature, just a formality, just a final step to make things easier for everyone. And I looked down at the papers, at the clean lines, the carefully structured language, the spaces where my name appeared again and again, and I let a small silence settle between us, not long enough to raise suspicion, just enough to shift the rhythm of the moment. Daniel stood nearby, not sitting, not fully engaged, just present in the way he had been all week, as if proximity alone fulfilled his role in all of this. And for the first time, I looked directly at him, not searching for hesitation, not hoping for intervention, just acknowledging him as he was now. And then I returned my attention to the papers. "You want me to sign today?" I said, my voice calm, even, and Ashley nodded, a slight smile forming, confident, certain. "It is the best time to move forward," she replied, and I nodded slowly, placing my hand lightly on the document, as if considering it, as if weighing something that had not already been decided. And then I looked up at her, meeting her eyes with a steadiness she had not seen from me before. "Then I think it is time we all understand exactly what we are moving forward with," I said, and before she could respond, before she could redirect the conversation back into the structure she had built, I reached into my bag and placed a different set of documents on the table, not with force, not with emphasis, just quietly, deliberately, aligning them neatly in front of her. For a moment, she did not react, because she did not expect anything to interrupt her plan, and that moment of hesitation was enough. "These are the original records," I continued, my voice still calm, still controlled. "The ones that were never altered, never transferred without authorization, never signed under assumption." And I watched as her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, the first crack in the certainty she had carried all week. Daniel stepped closer, his attention finally drawn into the moment, and I slid one of the pages toward him, not forcing it, just offering it, and he looked down, his brow tightening slightly as he read, comparing what was in front of him to what he thought he understood, and I let the silence stretch just long enough for recognition to begin forming. "There are discrepancies," I said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact, signatures that do not match, transfers that were not approved, authorizations that were never given. And Ashley straightened slightly, her composure returning quickly, because people like her do not lose control easily. They adjust, they recalibrate, they look for a way to regain the narrative. "There must be some confusion," she said, her tone still measured, but no longer as certain, and I nodded as if I understood. "That is what I thought at first as well," I replied, and then I reached for another document, placing it gently on top of the others, which is why I had everything reviewed. And this time, there was no hesitation, no delay in the shift that followed, because now the situation had moved beyond assumption and into verification. Daniel looked between us, his expression no longer neutral, no longer distant, and I could see the moment he realized that what he believed to be settled was not settled at all, and that realization did not come with anger or confrontation. It came with something quieter, something more unsettling, doubt. Ashley remained still for a second longer, her mind working through possibilities, searching for a way to reposition what was happening. But the structure she had built depended on my silence, on my compliance, and without those, it could not hold. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not in victory, not in satisfaction, just in completion, because this was never about proving something in a dramatic way. It was about restoring what had been quietly taken, and as I looked at both of them, I understood that the balance had shifted completely, not because I had raised my voice, not because I had fought back in the way they expected, but because I had done something far more effective. I had let them believe they had already won, and then I showed them that they had built their entire plan on something that was never true.